So we hear about John the Baptist usually a couple of times in the year. We hear the words of John the Baptist usually during the beginning of Advent, when we hear, "Prepare the way for the Lord," as we prepare for the Lord to come again, as we get ready for Christmas. And then we also hear John's words often at the beginning of Lent, another season of preparation, when we're getting ready for Easter, and the message of repentance and the desire to change and transform our lives is at the front and the center of our practice as a community of faith. But the reality is that in the scope of Jesus' life, we have in two Gospels, Matthew and Luke, stories about the Nativity and stories about Jesus' presentation in the temple, and then there's this huge gap. We have nothing at all until John. And all the Gospels agree that John really marks the beginning of Jesus. It's John's invitation to all of Judea to come and be renewed, to be refreshed, to be restored, to open themselves to the presence and the power of God, transforming them. It is that experience of John that launches Jesus' own ministry. The way this baptism of John, this baptism that Jesus participates in, is recalled by the four Gospels, is a little different in each case. They agree, though, on three things. They all agree that Jesus didn't just come by himself. Jesus came as part of a people who came. Jesus placed himself in the muchedumbre, in the crowd that showed up at the river that day, and the days that were before and after it as well. For hundreds, thousands came for John's baptism. All the Gospels agree that Jesus came with the people. All the Gospels also agree that somehow a dove manifested itself in a way that was experienced by Jesus and some of those around him to be a presence of the Spirit. It made me think a lot of the Nahuales in Aztec lore and in many indigenous peoples' lore, that when a certain animal comes into your realm and touches you, that animal becomes your spirit companion. In many ways, this dove comes and alights upon Jesus and is understood to be the Spirit companion, the companion of the Spirit, literally, which is bound to him. And the Gospels also all agree that once baptized, something about that experience compelled Jesus to go into the desert for an extended period of time to figure out what in the world all of this meant. Now, even though the details differ in other respects, those pieces are central. It is clear that once Jesus goes into the desert and returns, everything has changed for him. Everything. Nazareth, the hometown, no longer remains the place where he spends his days. Carpentry, which was his trade, is left so that he can become teacher, healer, preacher, Savior. Jesus' life spins on this moment of his baptism. And there are a few things about it that I believe played an important role in marking him. For I've watched these things play an important role in marking and changing other lives as well. The first is Jesus' experience of solidarity with the cut off and the cut out. The people who are of no interest to the majority of the powerful. The people who are on the edges. Jesus finds himself in solidarity with at the River Jordan. And that solidarity experience marks him. The next thing that I think is the experience of God's declaration of belovedness over his life, I think, marks him. And perhaps in particular because he hears that declaration of belovedness right at the moment that he is identified with the cut off and the cut out. The people who nobody thinks are worthy. That's when the declaration of worthiness comes to him. And it is those two things, that experience of solidarity and that powerful experience of acceptance and belovedness, that propel him to share what he has known with others in everything he says and everything he does. So I want to look at those three pieces: solidarity, the belovedness, and the sharing of those things in a little more detail this morning. As I looked over the passage and I was reflecting on Jesus' baptism and that experience of coming to the river with all the people who felt bad about themselves, who felt like things were not good, who felt like they needed help from God, who felt like they were unworthy and needed to be washed. Jesus coming with all of those people who were cut off and cut out transformed him in ways that I too have experienced. But it made me remember a scene from the movie Motorcycle Diaries, which is the story of the transformation of a young man who lived in the higher echelons of Argentinian society, and who, on a whim, decided to take a journey with his best friend via motorcycle throughout the entire South American continent. And the experience of that journey put him in touch with the salt of the earth of the continent. The miners, the farmers, the field hands, the people who worked in mechanics' shops to help put their bikes together, the folks who frequented the taverns that they stumbled in and out of. And the experience of that young man touching the pain and the suffering of the rank and file members of his continent transformed him into the man we came to know as Che Guevara, a revolutionary who gave the rest of his life to the struggles for justice for those same people. There's a scene in that movie which is very much like a baptism. Che's birthday arrives, and he and his friend happen to find themselves among a group of doctors and nurses who are ministering to a leper colony that's on an island in the middle of the Amazon River, so they won't be touched by anyone, literally cut off, cut out. And they're celebrating his birthday and dancing, and in the middle of all the happiness of this well-to-do group of doctors who are serving the poor, certainly, but who still see themselves as different from those whom they serve. Che decides he wants to be with them on the island. And in the middle of the night, swims the Amazon to that island, to the chagrin and the horror and the anxiety and fear of all of the people around him, and arrives on the other side to be pulled from the waters, gasping for breath, and embraced by this community of very, very sick people who love him and make him their own. And he is changed. It is the moment on which his life turns. And what he has thought he would do for the rest of his life is set aside so that what he is called to do could happen. This past Thursday, the Interfaith Welcome Coalition, the group of churches from San Antonio who are trying to figure out how we can continue to respond both compassionately to individual mothers and children who are being detained by our immigration system, as well as in advocacy to change the policy of our nation, which didn't used to detain women and children, but now does, when they come across seeking to begin a legal process, that they have rights to try, but are being imprisoned until that process is engaged. And we had 2 women with us who just had come out of Karnes City Detention Center. And one of them shared her story. And as she sat in our midst and shared that story, the tears in the room began to flow from men and women alike as we listened to the suffering and the pain that she had been through. And what an incredible miracle it was for her after 6 months in prison, simply for trying to come here and find a path to a better life for herself and her child. 6 months in prison. Someone from the Interfaith Welcome community visited her in detention, and a ray of light opened up. And she got access to an attorney. And she got access to legal services that provided bond money. And she finally was able to be liberated from jail. And I can tell you, the experience of being in her presence that day redoubled the desire of every single one of us to work harder and faster for change. It was the experience of Archbishop Oscar Romero's companioning the priests of his community in El Salvador in the 1980s, 1970s, and then to 1980. It was his experience of walking beside them as they walked beside the people of their country that converted him from being a man of the aristocracy who supported the upper echelons of Salvadoran society to being one who walked among and gave his life for the poorest of the poor in his country. You see, solidarity with the cut out and the cut off will change you, will change me. It changed Jesus. In the midst of that solidarity, though, something even more magnificent happened. A word came to Jesus that confirmed for him God's heart, God's love for all of those who felt so very unloved. A word of worth, of worthiness. Many of us have experienced the importance of those kinds of words in our lives. Maybe it was a teacher who discovered in us a talent that we didn't even know we had to read or do mathematics problems or draw or paint in a way that was particularly special. And spoke a word of affirmation over us that said, you really are good at that. In a way that no one else had done before. Or maybe it was simply an after-school teacher like Hope or Ignacia who comes and sits down beside you to help you walk through tediously the problems that you're trying to figure out and can't make sense of in a way that makes you feel like you really are worth somebody spending their time with. Maybe it was that coach who saw a diamond in the rough as you were struggling on those early days of football or basketball or soccer or volleyball practice. And who said, look, you know, if you just do it this way, you might be more successful. Let me show you. And invested time and love in you in a way that made you feel worthy, worthwhile, valuable. Maybe it was your beloved who picked you out of all humanity and said, I want to spend my life with you. You are worthwhile. You are worthy. That word spoken over us is a powerful word. a word that changes and transforms us, a word that draws life out of us that we did not know was even there. And that's the word. That's the word that God spoke over Jesus in that moment. You are my beloved. You are valuable to me. You are my child. I love you. And you see, those two things completely and utterly shape who Jesus is and how Jesus lives the rest of his life. He sets to demonstrating that very thing over and over and over again to the people with whom he comes into contact from that point forward. Whether it's blind Bartimaeus, who's a beggar, sitting beside the road asking for alms to be able to support his life, and whose disciples say, stay over there, don't bother him. And Jesus says, no, come here. You're valuable to me. How can I serve you? I need to see. He restores his sight. Bartimaeus becomes a new man and begins to jump and shout and share everything that has happened that changed him. The one at the margins has been brought to the center and said, you're beloved. Or maybe it's Mary Magdalene, a hooker, fairly good from what her reputation must have been, who showed up while Jesus was eating in a Pharisee's house one day, and dressed in her hooker garb, bearing her hooker fragrances, comes to the feet of Jesus and anoints and washes and loves him in ways that women like that shouldn't do in public. And he says, my daughter, you are loved. And sends her transformed back into the world. But she can't stay away and becomes part of Jesus' community and walks with him and ministers with him from there forward. Maybe it's Zacchaeus, that rich tax collector who everybody hated and nobody would eat with, who Jesus says, hey Zacchaeus, I want to have dinner with you at your house today. Me? Yeah, you. I like you. I think you've got potential. And sits with him at table and invites him to a journey of transformation that has him return double anything he's stolen and find a new life under God's belovedness. See, baptism, whether it's Jesus' baptism or yours and mine, is about that declaration of love and worth and value over you and me. It's about saying, wherever you are, whatever you've done, there is room for you at this table. There is a place for you in this kingdom. There is work for you in this ministry. There is good for you here. Come. Be washed. Be loved. And be sent to give that to someone else. That's what baptism is about. And at the very end of Matthew's gospel, not any of the others do this, but at the end of Matthew's gospel, baptism returns. Because as Jesus is saying adios to his buddies, he says to them, go now, you, You guys who've experienced this with me, you guys, go now and bring others in and baptize them so that they too may know how much they are loved. Anthony DeMello says, the things you put your attention to are the things that will grow. The things you put your attention to are the things that will grow. And we spent a lot of time in the church, unfortunately, a lot of centuries, putting a lot of attention on what we do wrong, on how bad we are, on how terribly we've sinned, on how broken our lives and our practice are. I think it's about time we stop that. And we start putting our attention on what we want to grow. And that is that we are beloved, valued, worthy, worthwhile children of God. And so is everyone else. Let's grow that up as a sign of our baptism. Would you pray with me? Amoroso Dios, gracias por el privilegio de haber recibido esta palabra sobre nuestra vida, amado, amada. Danos el valor para poder salir de aquí y conferir a otros lo que hemos recibido. Amor y solidaridad, aún en lo peor de nuestra vida. En el nombre de Jesús te lo pedimos.